Enemy spotted.
Large pre-nuclear submarines from the 20th century had engines, batteries, and electric motors. On the surface, the submarine would use the engines. However, they could not be used when submerged due to their toxic exhaust fumes. Therefore, electric motors would consume battery power to propel the submarine for a limited time. The submarine would then need to resurface and use the engines to recharge the batteries. In this video, I'm going to recreate this dynamic in Besiege, which recently received the Splintered Sea update. Now, building the submarine in Besiege is not hard. Stick a few aquatic screws and rudders onto barrels and you get a boat. Now adjust the buoyancy of the barrels and you get a submarine. But Besiege physics do get a bit quirky, and in fact do not obey the laws of thermodynamics, specifically the first law: energy cannot be created nor destroyed. On the sample submarine, the screw is simply willing energy into existence. So how do I bring this into Besiege? By disgustingly overcomplicating the build. For the submarine, I decided to make a steam engine. Like the engines in a real submarine, Besiege steam engines cannot operate underwater due to the extinguishing of the flame heating the water guns. Now, I have experimented with combustion engines before. This prototype uses grenades, but combustion engines are complex enough to be a video on their own. Despite the majority of 20th century submarines using diesel, steam engines have found their way on submarines, such as the British K-class submarine. They were absolutely awful, but they did exist. To test if this engine has adequate power, I stuck on some barrels and screws, and just look at this cute thing go. I just love the steampunk aesthetic from the gears. Now the reason why the screws are so long is because I have difficulty getting steam engines up to high RPMs, so to provide enough thrust I have very long screws. At this point, I was satisfied with the power generation from this engine, so I moved on to the battery. Here's the problem. Electricity doesn't exist in Besiege, and powered mechanical blocks have infinite energy. Now I could limit an infinite source of rotational energy with logic blocks, but that feels like a cop-out. So my next overcomplicated idea was to use either spring or winch blocks. These blocks may have infinite energy, but their usage is limited by their length. Their length therefore acts as their charge or stored energy, and to charge them, you distance their connection points. Here's an example. As this winch rope shortens, it pulls this chain that then spins a gear connected to an overdrive. The overdrive increases the output RPM and adds resistance to increase battery life. In this sense, these gears are acting like the electric motor of a submarine, converting the stored energy in the battery into usable rotational energy. Here's the more polished version of the battery, with a fully looped chain to add tension for recharging. It also has two springs instead of winches, as they don't need to be unwound, and this timer block. If the spring contracts fully, the chain rips apart even with low strength values. So this timer block very briefly contracts the spring over and over, allowing for a steady pull without tearing the chain. Once the springs have pulled to their closest points, the battery is out of charge. To recharge the battery, the chain needs to be winded back to its original position to re-lengthen the springs. Adding a few barrels and extending the screw then allowed for a distance test. As this ugly build scraped along, I noticed that its speed decreased as the springs shortened. Overall though, I was satisfied with the test and moved on to connecting the battery with the engine. I then also added the motor. Both of these connections needed to be separable, since the engine doesn't have the power to charge the battery while connected to the overdrive, and we want battery power running into only the motor, not the engine. Running the motor off the battery worked well, but the engine struggled to recharge the battery. So I had it wind the chain from both sprockets, which seemed to help in this next trial. The battery runs the motor and the engine recharges the battery, so the battery can run the motor again. I centered the engine, added the screws, and then started linking the engine to the screws through this gap in the battery. First, the engine runs the screws. Second, the battery runs the motor, which turns the screws. Once the battery is out of juice, the engine can run the screws and recharge the battery. Personally, I think the completed mechanics look beautiful, and they are even in the silhouette of a submarine. I strapped on some barrels for a sea trial, and wow! On engine power, the sub is slow, and under battery power, it is even slower. In a sense, that is accurate to real submarines, but honestly, the Turtle and HL Humley could probably outpace this thing. I didn't expect Besiege to actually add water resistance to the screws, as they are certainly spinning slower than they did out of water. To bring back some excitement, let's talk torpedoes. I made these rather simple, with fins, a barrel, a warhead, and screws. And yes, these screws are self-powered. I know, it's counterintuitive to the work I put into the submarine propulsion. Actually, now that Besiege has flywheels in the game, it could be interesting to try building the real-life Howell torpedoes. They had a flywheel spun up by a steam turbine, which not only powered its propulsion, but also gave gyroscopic stabilization. Maybe for a future video. Anyways, these torpedoes have a small timer block that after release raises the buoyancy of the barrel. This is to keep the torpedoes around neutrally buoyant at first, but then have them run along the surface once it clears the torpedo bay. I put 3 torpedoes on each side, and the release mechanism folds down to prevent the rear torpedoes from colliding into it. After adding the torpedoes, I put together a control panel for first-person use consisting of gauges, an indicator panel, and a wheel because it's fun. The indicator panel has 3 main sections. The upper left, this section shows what is currently connected between the battery, engine, and screws. The bottom section shows battery life detected by length sensors. 5 lights means it's fully charged, and a light will go out as battery power is used. Finally, the upper right section is the torpedo panel, with each piston representing the torpedoes left and right of the submarine. Now that all the internals are finished, I slapped on a basic outside shell for aesthetics. This shell did add additional weight and drag that further slowed the submarine, but drip is forever, so now it's time for the trials. What you just watched was my most successful trial attacking from below. However, before that successful run, I had lots of failures, both from me and from the submarine. Sometimes, I simply launched torpedoes too early, but if you recall the intro to this video, one recurring issue was the rearmost torpedoes blowing up the bow of the submarine. To fix this, I had to get rid of this lip the torpedoes were colliding with. After that was fixed, I managed to get my first successful trial on the surface, but the absence of the torpedoes made the submarine rear heavy. So, I binded the torpedo launch keys with keys to lower the buoyancy of the front barrels, and added separate keys to be able to trim the forward or rear barrel buoyancies. It's thanks to these changes that allowed for this eventual victory. Now the obvious issue to this design, other than the open cabin,
I am under the water. Please help
is
me.
its embarrassingly slow speed. Some of that is a problem with design. I could definitely upgrade both the engine and the battery. For example, here's another battery design I tested that resembles a mousetrap. However, another issue is the way Besiege calculates drag. Unlike reality, Besiege creations cannot be watertight, as the water in Besiege penetrates the entire build, and then accounts all blocks in the water in calculating drag. This is why the original steamboat was so quick, with only the bare minimum number of blocks in the water. This is also why adding the shell, which would in reality could streamline designs to be more hydrodynamic, only became additional submerged blocks that added drag. So, If you're interested in seeing me build a better submarine, or a Howl torpedo, or really anything in any game, please let me know. And thanks for watching.